Good morning, and welcome to the first session of the day, Crossing Seas. Before we start, just a few little bits of housekeeping. Firstly, please make sure your cell phones are turned off. A colleague I used to work with, if in classes students' cell phones went off, she used to make them stand up and sing the ringtone. And I think we might employ the same strategy here, so make sure they're turned off. Secondly, a reminder that the copies of the journal American Art are on sale today and tomorrow at the registration desk, and also that books by a number of the speakers at this symposium are on sale in the bookstore. There's a separate display of those, so lovely shopping opportunities for all of you. And also, you may have noticed yesterday there was a clanging noise that sort of haunted the proceedings. This wasn't people being heckled by builders, but there is construction going on, and so if there is some clanging, please ignore it. It's nothing to be alarmed about. And I'd also, before we start, I'd also like to just add my thanks to Cindy Mills and Amelia Gerlitz and their colleagues for organising this amazing event. I think we all sense this is a watershed conference and one that will have an impact on the field for some years to come. So I want to begin my very brief introductory comments, perhaps unexpectedly, with a quotation from James Joyce's Ulysses. In the Ithaca section of the novel, Leopold Bloom turns on a tap. Joyce asks, and I quote, "Did it flow? Yes. From Roundwood Reservoir in County Wicklow of a cubic capacity of 2,400 million gallons, percolating through a subterranean aqueduct of filter mains of single and double pipage, constructed at an initial plant cost of £5 per linear yard by way of the Dargle, Rathdown, Glen of the Downs and Callowhill, to a 26-acre reservoir at Stillorgan, and thence through a system of relieving tanks to the city boundary at Eustace Bridge." And so it continues, breathlessly spreading out more and more until we get to the ocean of Mercator's projection, its unplumbed profundity in the sun-dammed trench of the Pacific exceeding 8,000 fathoms. And even then, the water flows on and on through the ice caps, the Dead Sea, and finally ending in stagnant pools in the waning moon. I quote this not simply because I have an unerring instinct for pretentiousness, but because it seems to capture what is at stake in this session. Do art and culture also flow? Yes. And water is often the medium of their circulation. In British art history, as much as American art history, there's an increasing attention to transoceanic traffic. In art, in objects, in people, in bodies, in ideas. Both fields have recognized the need to move away from the insular and parochial, from a sense of national schools tightly constrained by borders and coastlines. In the case of Britain, this has been widely discussed as both an historical necessity and an ethical one, and I think the same holds true for America. The ocean is at once topographical, imaginary, political, and ideological, and this session will hint at the idea of the Atlantic as a palimpsest, its watery surface inscribed and reinscribed with the roots of competing empires and traffics. While the ocean may be a conduit for the flow of art, it's also a space of transformation. The transoceanic journey changes the traveller, not least because his or her journey is freighted with the experience of travel itself. It changes objects too. The teapot or portrait that arrives in Boston is different from the one that left the dock at Liverpool. And of course, subjects become objects. People leave Elmina Castle as humans and arrive in Jamestown as chattels. Seas are continuous and discontinuous with terra firma. As we all know, they separate, but they also connect. And in particular, seas make apparent transnational or transcultural blocks, those other geographies that don't conform to topography. Think, for instance, of the difference between the visible coherence in Sargent's portraits of the transatlantic plutocracy and the class contradictions played out in their homes on Fifth Avenue or in Mayfair. Or consider the subculture of Whitmanites in the late 19th century, a country of its own with borders that contain Davos, Sheffield, Toronto, and Philadelphia, where the sea brings homosexual men together in reality and in imagination. There's another dissonance that sea crossings make very clear. Too often, scholars assume that politics and culture are coterminous, that images and objects always match up to the values and commitments of their makers and owners. The world of sea crossings, of dislocations and homecomings, can reveal how people make a new life with old objects, or return to an old life with new things, or how rational and political values can be undermined by the feelings of exile or fear or loss that visual culture so often mitigates. The logic of Mercator's projection may be at odds with the unplumbed depths of experience. Finally, to look at the sea is to ask where our horizon lies and where we see the horizon from. In talking of the Atlantic, one might well ask, whose Atlantic? Recent work has emphasized this in its talk of the French Atlantic or the Iberian Atlantic or the Black Atlantic. And it's evident too in the debate about the shift from transatlantic to circum-Atlantic study. And I think the terms of this debate provide an important reminder that salt waters can corrode cultural norms. A fundamental premise of art history as a discipline is that cultures are located and locatable phenomena. But to view art from aboard ship, as it were, is to shift our attention from location to mobility, from stasis to flow. And such a history of art can open the discipline to the radical and endless connectedness that Mr. Bloom's glass of water so wonderfully symbolizes. And I think this session will challenge the limits of our field in this way by addressing not the local and global, but the more or less connected. And our speakers, in exemplary fashion, will suggest that we'd all do well to set sail from the safety of our scholarly harbours and embark on a rougher and more difficult voyage. First to speak is Kevin Muller from the San Francisco Art Institute, whose title is Queen Anne and the Four Indian Kings, a Transatlantic Dialogue. Second is Jennifer Roberts from Harvard University, who will talk on Copley's Cargo. And third is Margaretta Lovell, winner of this year's Charles C. Eldridge Prize, who speaks on trophy heads. We'll hold all questions and comments until after all three papers. So to begin, please welcome Kevin Muller.
On Wednesday, the 19th of April, in the year 1710, 4 Native Americans stepped down from their coaches and onto the streets of London. Known to contemporaries as the Four Indian Kings, their visit to the Old World had been orchestrated by American colonists in response to a failed Anglo-Indian invasion of Montreal the previous summer. Colonial volunteers and Native American warriors had gathered 9 months before for a coordinated land-sea attack and waited for a fleet of Royal Navy warships that never arrived. Queen Anne and her ministers, then fighting Louis XIV and his allies, in what is known as the War of Spanish Succession, had diverted the ships to Portugal. The expedition against Montreal was called off, but colonists remained hopeful it could be implemented the following year, provided they could first restore their credibility among their Native American allies, especially the Iroquois, who lived in the strategic region between Britain's North American colonies and New France, and second, convince the Crown of the urgency of their situation. Therefore, to impress upon the Iroquois true English military might and prevail upon the Queen to commit another fleet, a handful of resourceful colonists came up with the strategy of taking 4 Native Americans, 3 Iroquois and 1 Mohican to be exact, and presenting them as Native American sovereigns. The Indian kings were welcomed with an audience before the Queen, to whom an interpreter read a speech they had written, and no doubt formulated with the assistance of the colonials and the Queen's own ministers. The kings explained that their people, the Iroquois, had fully supported the expedition against Montreal, but because of its failure, they now feared French reprisals. They explained their great desire for a second expedition, which, if successful, would restore their prestige and, more importantly, provide them with access to furs in the West, in turn allowing them to establish a great trade with the English. But, the kings warned, their support would be withdrawn if the crown disappointed them again. Lastly, they requested a Christian missionary to attend to Iroquois spiritual needs. Queen Anne agreed to consider their requests, and for the remainder of their time in London, they were feted at her expense. They dined with dukes, toured the dockyards, admired the chapel at Whitehall, reviewed the troops, and sat for 3 different portrait painters, including John Verhelst, a painter of Dutch background who was commissioned by the Queen herself to paint a full-length portrait of each Indian king. Of all the pictorial representations of the kings produced in London on the occasion of their visit, Verhelst's portraits are unique because only his had a transatlantic distribution. The original oils went to Kensington Palace, Queen Anne's royal residence just outside of London, but shortly before they left the artist's studio, each painting was reproduced as a mezzotint print. In 1711, 1 year after the king's visit to London, sets of these prints traveled the Atlantic and were given as gifts to native representatives from each of the Iroquois 5 nations to be hung in their longhouses. The following year, colonial leaders received sets of these prints, along with specific directions to hang them in their state houses. It remains unclear whether the crown originally intended these portraits to be sent to the New World or whether events transpired that made them useful in that context. In either case, the transatlantic distribution of Verhelst's portraits is revealing, because it indicates the portraits were understood as uniquely capable of influencing the conduct of both Anglos and natives, which they could by visualizing the very real material benefits of upholding the alliance affirmed between Queen Anne and the Indian kings, and more importantly, the dire consequences of breaking it. Based on the imagery and iconography of the finished portraits, Verhelst must have been commissioned to portray the Indian kings in the state portrait format. This subgenre of European portraiture, exemplified by Anthony van Dyck's mid-17th century portrait of King Charles I, characteristically represented European sovereigns full length, elegantly posed, and surrounded by the signifiers of royal authority. Verhelst must have realized, however, that he could not utilize exactly the conventions seen here, because his subjects were neither culturally nor politically equal to European monarchs. Thus, Verhelst was faced with a problem: to turn 4 natives seen by most Englishmen as savages into sovereigns, possessing real legitimate power. They were, after all, kings by definition of the English crown, and their authority was critical to British imperial plans in North America. These 4 portraits were commissioned, painted, reproduced, and originally viewed as a set. And when the 4 are seen all together, their similarities and some important differences stand out. All share a similar compositional format of a single figure posed in the foreground of a densely wooded landscape, which represents the wilds of North America. In the context of early 18th century European portraiture in everyday life, their regal poses would have signified an elite social position, for only those with the knowledge and time to cultivate such stately postures possess the wealth to have others labor on their behalf. These bodies are, however, a studio fiction. Following standard procedure of the time, Verhelst carefully painted each man's head and shoulders from life, but completed the remainder of the portrait in the sitter's absence. Thus, Verhelst did not take these poses from life, and by all accounts, the kings did not stand like this in public, but preferred to squat, as was their custom. It was nonetheless appropriate Verhelst should represent each man as if he adhered to the familiar rules of European elite comportment, because it was necessary to convey their status as royalty. Despite their shared aristocratic comportment, Verhelst portrayed one of these Indian kings, identified as Tiini Hogaro, differently. Upon their arrival in London, all 4 men, inappropriately underdressed for kings, were taken to a tailor who made for each a costume consisting of a scarlet mantle edged with gold, a white linen shirt, and a black ensemble consisting of coat, breeches, hose, and shoes. Red mantles were a long-standing symbol of kingship dating back to antiquity. Black attire was deemed necessary because Queen Anne was then in mourning over the death of her husband, Prince George of Denmark. Verhelst portrayed all four men wearing their mantles, but only T.E. Ni Hogaro also wears his black garments. The others are dressed in just the long shirt, tied with a belt decorated with moose hair or porcupine quills, and moccasins. T.E. Ni Hogaro also holds up a belt of wampum, unlike the others who wield weapons. And the forested background behind T.E. Ni Hogaro is devoid of any figures, whereas in the other three portraits, we find figures either engaged in the hunt or, in one case, clubbing a prostrate victim. These differences identify T.E. Ni Hogaro as the statesman of the group. Because he dresses in black, he appears more familiar with European court etiquette, in this case by paying proper respect to a court in mourning. By wearing his shirt and coat open at the neck, however, he appears simultaneously ungentlemanly, thus a marginal figure to European culture, an appropriate status given his geographic origins at the margin of empire, the latter signified by his Native American belt and the sash beaded with wampum that he holds. This item, which Verhelst has rendered in acute detail, was a fundamental symbol of Native American diplomacy whose use was familiar to the crown. During their audience with the Queen, the Indian kings presented her with belts of wampum, which according to Anglo-Indian diplomatic protocol were to be offered when the terms of a treaty or other negotiation were proposed. The Queen accepted the belts, which indicated she would seriously consider the king's speech. She then affirmed her alliance with them by reciprocating with gifts of her own, a cache of trade goods for each man that included guns, knives, and cloth. Given the importance of this exchange, it is likely that the beaded belt Verhelst painted is one of the actual belts given by the kings to the Queen. If T.E. Ni Hogaro appears as statesman, Verhelst casts the other three kings as warriors. The weapon each man holds serves as the primary attribute of that rank. Two of these items, the ball-headed club and the flintlock musket, are rendered with such clarity and precision that Verhelst may have studied actual examples. Similarly, the detailed moccasins and quill-adorned belts, identical in each painting, suggest the painter may have also had access to these items. It is unlikely, however, he observed the Indian kings wearing just long white shirts while in London because their hosts would have not permitted it. Verhelst evidently knew, however, that Indian warriors did wear European-style shirts in the North American wilderness. Colonial officials often gave such shirts to warriors at treaty negotiations. And thus, these three kings' outfits were accurate and appropriate for men who had a reputation for hunting and waging war on foot, a point underscored by the figures hunting and fighting in the backgrounds of each of these portraits. This compositional format of a sitter portrayed full length in the foreground with a similarly dressed figure hunting in the distance was not a characteristic of English, but of Scottish Highland portraiture, such as this portrait of Lord Mungo Murray, painted in the late 1680s. This greatly admired painting, widely reproduced in early 18th century London, was identified at the time as depicting, quote, a Scotch lord drawn in that garb he hunts or goes to visit the clans, end quote. As this comment reveals, the portrait was identified not by the sitter's name, but by description, as a figure exotic to the English who wore unique clothing carrying specific socio-political connotations. Scottish Highlanders were known by the English to dress in garb which signified their clan affiliation. Writing in the 1720s, the English author Daniel Defoe characterized the people of the Highlands as living dispersed across the north of Scotland, where the gentry acted like, quote, little monarchs, end quote, leading their vassals. The Highland lord was thus a lesser king, a feudal lord, who parceled out land in exchange for fealty. The composition of Wright's portrait conveyed something of this feudal organization by picturing Murray paused in the midst of the hunt, itself a training ground for warfare, while a second figure in the distance, who wears the same garb and is therefore from Murray's clan, continues the chase. The second man is not Murray's equal, as he does not pause to stand beside him, but is in fact his kin subordinate. Verhelst may have been inspired to reuse this composition in his portrayal of the Indian kings, having learned from contemporary accounts that the Iroquois, like Highlanders, lived in clans. Indeed, the animal at the foot of each Indian king symbolizes his clan affiliation. While clan organization was important for the Iroquois, in point of fact, theirs was not a feudal society. Their political and social organization was much more complex, and according to some scholars, the British never did fully understand it. Nonetheless, by borrowing this format, Verhelst was able to present the Indian kings as living according to a form of political organization familiar to his countrymen. With this in mind, when Verhelst's four portraits are seen all together, the Indian kings' relationships to each other becomes clear. If the portraits are arranged in the order seen here, as I believe they should be, the more Europeanized statesman, Ti'i-ni-ho-ga-ro, appears at the head of the lesser warrior kings, who, like vassals, stand before him ready to follow his orders and lead their own charges into battle, and they can be seen in the backgrounds of their portraits. The ultimate power of the kings, then, stemmed from their ability to marshal their warriors, a point underscored by the figure who clubs another man in the background of the second Indian king's portrait. But Ti'i-ni holds them at peace, offering the belt of wampum in their direction, and ours as well. These peaceable intentions are further underscored by the conspicuously placed trade axes at all four kings' feet, a reference to the phrases bury the hatchet or put down the hatchet, both of which entered the English lexicon in the 17th century as a result of an adaptation of Native American metaphorical language. Completed shortly after the kings left London, Verhelst's original oils were hung in Kensington Palace, where they became part of an assemblage of portraits that made visible familial and political alliances established by Queen Anne and her ministers. There, they perhaps also implied a shift in the conduct of the current war against France, if one considers that they were hung in a small room that was entered only by first passing through a hall dedicated to portraits of Royal Navy admirals, including these two seen here. This arrangement visually replicated the predominant geographic feature that separated England from Native America, namely the Atlantic Ocean, and also implied that naval power was the means to bridge that gap. The Indian kings thus appeared as England's important and powerful allies, who through newly restated support of the Royal Navy, absent the previous year, could expand the current war with France to North America. Significantly, the king's visit had been supported by ministers intent on shifting the focus of the war away from land-based campaigns on the European continent to naval engagements. Thus, once hung in Kensington Palace, Verhelst's portraits assumed their expected role of reminding the Queen's guests of their obligation to uphold the Anglo-Iroquois alliance affirmed during the Four Kings' visit, and also to support this new blue water policy. For if the Navy could not be used to support the Iroquois would no longer serve as a buffer between England's North American colonies and New France, and England risked the possibility of losing these colonies, or at least suffering bloody attacks on them by the French and their Indian allies. The first distribution of print sets in North America occurred in 1711, just prior to the second planned invasion of Montreal. At this time, sets were given to leaders of the Iroquois Five Nations, and one unique set, framed and under glass, was presented with instructions that it be hung in the Longhouse at Onondaga, the geographic and political center of the Five Nations. By distributing these portraits on the eve of the second invasion, at the centers of Iroquois decision-making, colonial representatives evidently sought to persuade all Iroquois, who were then divided between pro-English and pro-French factions, of the material benefits of allying themselves with the English. Whether the Iroquois perceived the subtler points of kingship implied in the portraits is unclear, but they surely recognized the value of the trade goods pictured, including guns, knives, shirts, cloth, and trade axes, all rendered in attractive detail. These goods were highly desired not only for personal use, but for their potential to elevate the status of the owner. One way an Iroquois man could build his prestige was by distributing gifts, which obligated the receiver to repay him. The English understood and exploited this practice when the Queen gave the Indian kings the trade goods seen here, part of a much larger cache, far in excess of what either any of these single men could use for their own personal use. No doubt the Crown hoped that through the distribution of these gifts, each man would hold influence over his tribesmen. Indeed, the English knew the Iroquois preferred English trade goods to French, and thus in this area they held an advantage over their enemy. Hung in the Iroquois longhouses, the mezzotint prince would continually convey the message that alliance with the English could bring material prosperity and potentially increased individual power. Perhaps this is why more than 600 Iroquois warriors participated in the Second Montreal invasion, 150 more than the first. Unfortunately, this second attack was also a failure, as many of the transport ships were wrecked en route, resulting in a great loss of life. Remarkably, however, the power of the portraits outlived their initial duty. The following year, a Reverend Andrews, sent by the Queen at the King's request, arrived in the colonies to establish a mission in upstate New York. With him came 192 unframed sets of the mezzotint prints. That's a total of 768 individual prints, and 97 portrait prints of Queen Anne, all to be distributed among Native Americans. In the post-expedition context, these portraits were most certainly intended to remind the pro-English Iroquois, who had suffered a second loss of prestige, that the alliance between themselves and England was still in effect, and that material benefits were to be had by remaining faithful to it. As the prints were this time distributed by a clergyman, however, these benefits became coupled to their acceptance, the Iroquois and Native American acceptance, of the Protestant faith. Andrew's instructions also stated that additional sets of portraits were to be hung in the council chambers in the state houses of Maryland, Virginia, New York, and Massachusetts, the latter seen here on the left. Here, the mezzotint prints would have hung near a portrait of the Queen and perhaps a portrait of the current governor, thus functioning in a manner like the original paintings concurrently hanging in Kensington Palace, themselves serving as a kind of master narrative at the center of empire. These portraits, the prints, were to remind the colonial gentlemen who comprised the council, and who undoubtedly possess a variety of opinions about Indians, about each other, and about the Crown's policy, which had failed them twice. They remind the colonial gentlemen who comprised the council of their individual and collective duty to uphold the alliance with the Iroquois as affirmed by their queen. Unlike the Kensington Palace, however, these state houses bordered Native America, which made the benefits of upholding an Anglo-Iroquois alliance, as well as the risks of disrupting it, all the more immediate. Colonists were best positioned to reap profits from the Indian trade, especially the fur trade, but they would also feel the wrath of betrayed Iroquois warriors. Perhaps it was the implied threat of violence underpinning the Indian king's authority that could keep colonials living at the edge of Britain's burgeoning North American empire, far from the grasp of royal authority, from acting in their own interests. Thus, like the sash of wampum offered in exchange for the allegiance of the receiver, so the distribution of images of the four Indian kings exerted similar obligations of loyalty among the very distant and awful willful subjects of the crown. Thanks.
Okay, before beginning, I'd also like to thank Cindy and Amelia for the precision instrument that is this symposium. Very impressive. I'd also like to thank the Stanford Humanities Center for giving me a year to think about the 18th century, which is something that I've been wanting to do for a very long time. And also, I'd like to thank Jules Prown, who was the first person to introduce me to Copley, but who is not in any way responsible for any errors or problems with my interpretation of this painting. Among historians of American art, John Singleton Copley's Boy with a Squirrel is best known, indeed almost exclusively known, for its role in a famous transatlantic tale. When the painting was made in 1765, Copley was a young British painter, largely self-taught, working in the bustling colonial city of Boston. He'd become hugely successful as a provincial portrait painter, but was determined to know how his work would be received by the aesthetic establishment on the other side of the Atlantic. So he painted Boy with a Squirrel as a demonstration piece, packed it up, and shipped it to London for exhibition. It was Copley's first major non-commissioned work, his first exhibition painting, and the first painting he produced to be sent across the Atlantic. A few months later, he received the welcome news that no less an authority than Joshua Reynolds had called the painting a very wonderful performance, despite a certain over-minuteness in the composition. Reynolds affirmed Copley as a precocious talent and encouraged him to come to London for more training as soon as possible. Now, the transatlantic triumph of Boy with the Squirrel has long served as an inaugural episode in histories of American art. It's been used in several ways, most often to anchor arguments for the birth of a uniquely American empirical aesthetic. In every such narrative, the painting is rightly seen to derive its historical significance from its famous transatlantic relay. However, in every such narrative, that relay itself has been almost completely elided. In each telling, the painting's passage across the ocean is for all intents and purposes treated synoptically. Copley sends, Reynolds receives, Copley hears back, all in the space of a sentence or two. The massive expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, its navigational and cultural particularities, the long delays that it imposed upon Copley's aesthetic transaction, none of these obstacles have been considered relevant to the close interpretation of the painting. The painting remains always unproblematically present, both to the protagonists and to the historian, and never suffers in the telling its status as cargo on a wide and uncertain ocean. So my question for today is this: how might our view of this painting change if we were, in essence, to really put the Atlantic back into Copley's Atlantic world, if we were to allow the protraction and difficulty of the painting's Atlantic passage to figure in our understanding of Copley's aesthetic dialogue with London? The theorist Nelson Goodman wrote in 1968 that, quote, "Such properties as weighing 10 pounds or being in transit from Boston to New York on a certain day hardly affect the status of a painting in its representational scheme," end quote. I hope to question such seemingly reasonable claims here and to suggest that we might do well to attend to such factors as weight and time and transit in our analysis of American art and its movement through the global networks that have brought us all here today. I think Boy with a Squirrel is a particularly rich candidate for this kind of vehicular analysis, if we can call it that, because Copley created it specifically and carefully in order to be dispatched across the sea. Moreover, in doing so, he departed quite substantially from his usual pictorial habits. And it will ultimately be my assertion that Boy with a Squirrel registers the complications of its own transmission. So Let's actually just start looking at the painting. I'd like to begin very simply, pointing out a few relatively superficial elements of iconography and emblematic meaning. And I'm doing this just because I'd like to suggest how quickly I think the painting begins to respond when we approach it as a transatlantic communications device, a work that's fundamentally about transoceanic passage. I also simply think it's important to look at this painting for a change, because despite its canonical status in the field, there's actually been remarkably little careful work done on its formal and visual qualities, certainly nothing like Watson and the Shark, for example, which has been the topic of exhaustive analyses. In fact, I think that it's precisely its anecdotal serviceability that has precluded further looking in this case. So we might first note, for example, that in no other painting did Copley include a glass of water. Granted, its ostensible purpose here is simply to showcase Copley's hard-earned technical skills in rendering transparency and reflection. But surely the water glass is a curiously overdetermined object to include in one's first transatlantic painting, especially since the boy's hand gesture, and with it that lovely suspensional arc of the squirrel's chain, carefully spans the precise diameter of the glass. Whatever else we might say about this motif, it's undeniable that it involves the passage of a sensory chain across a body of water and thereby presents in microcosm the plight or task of the painting itself. The squirrel is also worth some preliminary remarks. Chained squirrels held daintily by women and children were fairly common in colonial American portraits. As Paul Stady has shown, they indicated the proper education of the sitter, whose refinement was indicated by his or her successful domestication of the wild creature. And Roland Fleischer has, of course, shown that as emblematic devices, squirrels signified diligence and patience. But when we consider these emblematic meanings, in light of the transatlantic mission of the painting, they suddenly leap to a higher level of significance and self-reflexivity. For it's not really the refinement of the sitter that this painting was made to display, but rather that of the painter. It's Copley, not Pelham, who's the sitter, whose diligence is being tested. And as for patience, the painting's long trip across the Atlantic will require it in spades. Moreover, Boy with a Squirrel's squirrel is not just any squirrel, but specifically a flying squirrel, hence that delicate ruff of skin there along its belly. This is a species native to North America with obvious connections to the themes of movement and transit under consideration here. And these connotations were in fact overtly acknowledged in the 18th century. Both squirrel and flying squirrel were common names for the schooners, sloops, and men of war that passed regularly through Boston in the 1750s and 1760s. Now, I won't linger on that issue except simply to note that Copley lived in a community and in a historical moment in which people knew the names of the ships that stopped in their harbors. He understood the metaphorical and mechanical dimensions of the shipping world to which he would be entrusting his painting. He was born in Boston around 1738 and spent the first 10 years of his life living in his mother's tobacco shop on Long Wharf, which you can see there in the center of this print from 1764. Long Wharf is an immense pier jutting then as now a quarter mile into the center of Boston Harbor. Basically, Copley as a child would have awakened each morning to a noisy, smelly, colorful panorama of merchant shipping activity, and it would have been a bit like keeping an apartment in a FedEx hangar at Logan Airport today, I think. In his 20s, he went on to build his painting career on commissions from families like the Hancocks, who ran the largest transatlantic shipping firm in Boston, and he would, of course, later marry the daughter of the Boston agent for the British East India Company. So in short, Copley's life and livelihood depended in nearly every particular on the successful transportation of objects and people across and around the oceans. Of course, in the 18th century, the entire British Empire was what Joseph Roach has called an oceanic interculture. It was a culture whose very survival, as well as its habits of thought and expression, were bound up in the effects that oceanic transport had upon objects, communication, and community. These effects derived largely from the acute heterosynchrony that haunted all transoceanic communication. Even without navigational errors, pirate attacks, or bad weather, it took at least a month to cross the Atlantic. This was not a neat and predictable delay either. First, it was asymmetrical. Crossing toward London took roughly 4 weeks, while crossing toward Boston against the westerly currents took almost twice as long. This delay was also discontinuous. 5 ships launched from London in a particular order, for example, did not necessarily arrive at Boston in their original tidy sequence. These long, uncertain intervals meant that concerns about decay, delay, and mistransmission impacted every form of transatlantic communication. It meant that there were enormous pressures to find ways to minimize the effects of time and passage on transported objects, to predict or foresee distant conditions, to produce at least the illusion, if not the reality, of simultaneity and co-presence between far-flung correspondents. Consider the drive to design faster ships and improve navigation, the preference for light, flat, or desiccated cargoes like mezzotins, textiles, and tea leaves, or the development of the British insurance and credit systems that were needed to help manage the risks of crossing the transatlantic gap. Even the really big questions, like the question of time with a capital T, were questions at this time of transoceanic coordination and synchrony. And I couldn't help showing you another celebrated transatlantic object of 1765. This is John Harrison's marine chronometer, which had just been triumphantly tested to demonstrate that it could keep near perfect time on long ocean voyages and could thereby solve the greatest navigational problem of the century, the determination of longitude on the open sea. And this clock was an exquisite feat of craftsmanship. It was able to mechanically counterbalance every natural force of marine disequilibrium, like rolling, pitching, changes in humidity and pressure that might buffet it at sea. Harrison's chronometer was intimately tied to the poetics of preservation, coordination, and synchrony that I have been discussing, for it was built not so much to tell time, but rather to keep time, to prevent the decay of time on long sea voyages. The sea clock was perhaps the perfect example of what Bruno Latour has called the immutable mobile, a kind of object that conveys information from place to place without allowing it to be affected by the physical strains of transportation. If this clock was set in London, it would still show London time miraculously preserved when it arrived, say, in Virginia. And this permitted a new and really unprecedented form, a glimpse of global simultaneity. One could really perceive London and Virginia at once. So if these themes of transoceanic preservation and coordination permeated British culture so thoroughly, why shouldn't they, and indeed how couldn't they, have also affected transoceanic painting? Couldn't Copley have faced analogous challenges and perhaps have devised analogous solutions? Certainly for Copley, the ambient threat of destruction, decay, and miscarriage applied to his cargo as much as to any other. His papers and letters are full of correspondence about lost and delayed transatlantic messages, gifts, and objects. They often discuss damages incurred to paintings in shipments between coastal cities, and even the outright loss of his works in transit. Problems of delay and misalignment also had serious ramifications in the sphere of aesthetics in the 18th century. Virtually every theorist in Europe called for immediacy, instantaneity, and unity both within paintings and within the communities that comprised the scenes of reception and recognition of paintings. Copley wanted to join this unified community. This was, after all, his main aim in sending his painting to London. But the only medium through which he could do so was profoundly and irrevocably heterosynchronous. How could Copley hope to enter into what Jules Prown has called a transatlantic correspondence course in aesthetics when nothing about such a course could ever truly correspond? So of course Copley did take material measures to ensure the safe and rapid passage of his painting. It was packed very carefully, kept in the luggage of a friend, etc. But if we're going to refute Nelson Goodman, who I quoted at the beginning of this talk, we must also be able to show that Copley took measures at the representational level to make his painting itself a successful device for transatlantic communication, and this brings us back to the painting. First, let's notice Copley's treatment of the drapery in Boy with a Squirrel. Its disposition is highly atypical, both of Copley and of period portraiture more generally. This is, I'm comparing it to his portrait of Nicholas Boylston from a couple years later. Whereas Copley's earlier and later portraits tended to follow the Van Dyckian convention of arranging this charismatic drapery as a decorative threshold opening to this expansive space behind the sitter. Here, in Boy with a Squirrel, Copley draws the drapery flatly behind the sitter. The curtain does not function as, quote, a stock stage set borrowed from the imitators of Sir Peter Lely, as James Flexner once described it, but rather as a conspicuous digression from just such conventions. It constrains the portrait to a relief flat space, encouraging a system of internal relationships without recessive outlet. It's this narrow setting that permits and supports Copley's turn to a particularly severe profile format in Boy with a Squirrel. Now, the significance and strangeness of this move on Copley's part has not been widely acknowledged. This is essentially the only profile portrait that Copley produced in America. There are two small exceptions that experts can take up with me later. This is essentially the only profile portrait that Copley produced in America, and while neoclassical profiles would become standard in the later 18th century, they were rare in Europe and exceedingly rare in America at this early date of 1765. Why did Copley use the portrait, the profile portrait here? Copley almost certainly knew this image by his friend, the Boston engraver Nathaniel Hurd, whose portrait he was painting around the time he was working on Boy with a Squirrel. Dated 1762, it's been identified by Ellen Miles as the first American image to incorporate profile portraits. Notice that Hurd makes no attempt to integrate the spatial world of the carefully framed, metal-like profiles with any sort of existing composition on the page. And I'm speaking, of course, of the two images on the right. This is King George and General Wolfe himself. He represents these portraits in clipius, which, as Marcia Poynton has explained in her work on 18th century portraiture, involves the nested framing of an image within a cartouche, as if it had been transposed or clipped, hence in clipius, clipped from one place and inserted into another. Poynton argues that mid-18th century profiles were so closely associated with the clipius form that they adopted its inherent structural significance. The profile, in other words, was understood to be a kind of transported vision, an image from elsewhere, a moving and mobile picture detached from any coherent relationship to any specific ground. These implications of detachment, displacement, and distance were also reinforced, of course, by the classical connotations of profile portraiture in the 18th century. As is well known, profiles were closely associated with Pliny's account in the Natural History of the origin of painting, in which a Corinthian maiden, whose lover was about to depart to detach himself for war, traced the outline of his profile on the wall as a mimetic reminder of his presence, and of portability and passage. The profile serves as a form of pictorial packaging. It's a way of preparing a portrait for geographical and temporal displacement. The profile permits the painting to enter an abstract space of transmission and exchange. Speaking of exchange, the profile also draws the painting into the associational orbit of what is perhaps the most mobile and circulatory of all objects, namely the coin. This connection is so essential to the transatlantic relay of Boy with a Squirrel that I think it's appropriate to refer to the painting as a numismatic profile. During the 18th century, as British culture continued to grapple with the advent of modern finance, the money economy, and the attendant volatility of property and value, the semiotic function of coins and other currency was a topic of intense debate. Commonly discussed was the purported capacity of coins to serve as a stable, unimpeachable, and universal form of transmission. Ancient coins, for example, were understood to have bridged space and time within the sprawling ancient empires. All of this had been neatly reinforced for moderns by Locke, who in his second treatise on government had argued that money circumvents the limitations of time and space because it is portable and it does not decay. It serves as a kind of reliable transportation and storage medium for value. Like the chronometer, it is a technology for healing problematic temporal and spatial gaps. So for an artist hoping to bridge a problematic Atlantic interval then, an appeal to coinage provided a logical solution. By turning so conspicuously to the numismatic profile, Boy with a Squirrel borrows the universalizing and detemporalizing powers of money and thus wishfully collapses the vast gap that complicated its own mission as an aesthetic emissary. Now, although I'm arguing that the need to bridge the Atlantic led Copley here to appeal to the transitive and generalizing properties of the coin and the profile, I don't mean to imply that Boy with a Squirrel is neatly equivalent or fully complicit with these technologies of empire and globalization. In a different setting, I would go on for another 30 minutes or so to explain the ways in which this painting comments on and worries over its very need to adopt these techniques. I'd want to address Copley's attempt, through his treatment of surfaces and volumes in the painting, to work through the relationship between the transitive print culture that he needed to engage and the grand manner painting that he wanted to produce. I'd want to address the complex drama of sensory dispersal going on in the painting. And here I'm talking about the way that all of the sensory signals around the head of the boy have been separated from each other and almost diffracted out away from the profile with these odd echoes of ears and eyes that he has placed in the drapery behind the boy. I'd want to look at this dispersal and its relationship to the inscription and sequencing of information in long-distance transmission in the period. I'd want to talk much more about the squirrel, which functions as a kind of mediator or tutelary figure for the viewer here, whose only point of visual reciprocity is through the squirrel's eye. I'd want to talk about the squirrel as a densely compacted focal zone of all of the compositional patterns in the painting, and about the body of this very squirrel as being perhaps the most perfect natural analog imaginable of a stretched canvas in transit. But since I can't possibly cram all of that into whatever time I have, which I think is about 2 minutes, and since a fuller version of this argument will, I hope, be published in American Art next spring, I'd like to peel away from this painting for now and make a few concluding remarks about the way this cargo project has forced me to rethink many of my own assumptions about art history and its role in the analysis of globalization. And I thought I might offer these thoughts in the form of 3 proposals or propositions. These are principles that continue to guide my own research and which I hope might also be useful or helpful to all of us as we attempt to make meaningful inroads into an understanding of the global context of American art. Number 1, proposing that we expand the definition of artistic media to include transportation and communication media. When identifying the medium through which Copley's Boy with a Squirrel took shape, we should move beyond oil on canvas to embrace a larger view of the picture's conditions of transitive possibility, oil on canvas, on merchant ship, on Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic subjected Copley's image to a unique and historically specific set of social, economic, military, and navigational conditions. Like any other artistic medium, the ocean configured the possibilities for meaning and expression. Whether over the ocean, the desert, the railroad, the airplane, the internet, images take form from their particular interstitial journeys. Number 2, that we consider the unchaperoned image. Our models of transnational artistic dialogue have been considered primarily by scholars addressing the travels of artists, and I'm thinking here of expeditionary or psychogeographical studies. And by no means do I intend to denigrate this scholarship. In fact, I'm profoundly guilty of adding to it myself. But I also sense that we have tended to lose sight of pictures and objects themselves as emissaries, as communicative devices in their own right in global conversations. Not all pictures were accompanied by interpreters. They themselves were necessarily charged with the tasks of holding, transmitting, and divulging meaning. And finally, number 3, that we replenish the intervals that once separated communities in the transnational system. Pierre Bourdieu, in his Logic of Practice, implores scholars looking back upon historical exchanges not to, quote, abolish the interval that originally separated the actions in question. Bourdieu argues that the deferral and uncertainty that thoroughly shape all human activity is precisely what the analytical eye of historical hindsight tends to obliterate, and that historians must reintroduce time with its rhythm, its orientation, its irreversibility into the analysis of cultural production. The study of objects in transit and the challenges attending their movement is, I think, one way of replenishing such intervals and allowing us to see the distances that challenged and indeed produced our own global world. Thank you.
Thomas Jefferson at Monticello was surrounded by heads. Here at the house he built for himself on top of a small mountain in central Virginia, the animate figures of his household, that is, family members, slaves, guests, business associates, Native Americans, and political allies, occupied the center of the rooms. There they dined and held conversations, exchanged information, and moved in a hierarchical set of socially prescribed choreographed steps. But against the wall, there were heads. The 3 rooms in which Jefferson located his heads are the entrance hall, A, the parlor, B, and the tea room, H, on this plan. These heads were of 4 kinds. First, there were the painted portraits of men he admired, such as Locke, who, together with Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton, constituted Jefferson's, as he put it, trinity of the 3 great men the world has ever produced. The 3 greatest men the world has ever produced. This triumvirate he hung together in the parlor. Could I have the next on the left, please? Second, there were the sculptural busts of patinated plaster of the remarkable contemporaries such as these by the French sculptor Jean-Antoine Houdon on consoles between the windows. 7 of these portrait busts Jefferson acquired in Paris directly from the sculptor. Most of the Americans and the Marquis de Lafayette were found here in the tea room. Voltaire was among those French intellectual figures grouped in the entrance hall with his own portrait by Houdon. The heads of these worthies, perched on pedestals or consoles, greeted visitors here in the most public room at Monticello. Third, there were animal heads, the skulls and antlers of remarkable specimens of natural history, such as these magisterial elk antlers, sent back to Jefferson by Lewis and Clark during their exploration of the Trans-Mississippi West during 1804, 1805, and 1806. These trophies included also fossil remains of extinct creatures, such as this excavated in 1807. Perhaps most startlingly to Jefferson's visitors were the taxidermized, post-mortem beheaded heads of such noble beasts as a bighorn sheep and a buffalo, for this was a novel head type in Jefferson's generation. And fourth, there were the severed heads of long-dead biblical figures, including this of St. John, his recognizably saintly features laid on a platter in a copy of a Guido Reni original that Jefferson had bought in Paris in 1785. Nearby, David held aloft the head of Goliath. Although scholars have made much of Jefferson's quick education in ancient and modern French architecture during the 5 years from 1784 to 1789 that he served as minister of the young United States to France, he was equally busy during these years assembling heads for Monticello. What was the function of Jefferson's assemblage of beasts and saints and exemplary men? How did he and his presidential guests read these disembodied heads and faces? First, I would note that Jefferson was by no means unique in hanging his reception hall, parlor, and breakfast room with this, to us, heterogeneous set of portraits. But he was unique in the breadth of his reach in selecting, collecting, and exhibiting these trophies in the public rooms of his domestic sphere. He hung his paintings tier on tier as he had seen paintings hung at the Louvre and elsewhere. George Washington appears to have, in part, shared Jefferson's taste in interior decoration, and, as in so many other things, preceded Jefferson. In 1759, when he was ordering wedding clothes for himself and his bride, Washington ordered busts of Alexander the Great, of Julius Caesar, and the Duke of Marlborough, somewhat smaller, and 2 wild, ferocious beasts. These were to be made of copper, enamel, or glazed, and were intended to fill up broken pediments over doors. They were, in other words, interior architectural ornaments, but they were also to have provided specific models of bellicose masculinity for Washington and his guests at Mount Vernon. The head as the seat of reason and the face as the locus of unique identity are privileged sites of aesthetic display. The portrait genre may include many elements, but its single desiderata and raison d'etre, as Gilbert Stuart put it, is pinning the unique head to the canvas. And no period in the history of American art saw a greater flourishing of painted and sculpted portraits than did the early national period. My study investigates the reasons for this fluorescence and some of the disparate cultural threads that crossed in this movement of heads from the center of rooms on bodies to the periphery on walls, from the changing, aging, and dying bodies of history's participants to the fixity of taxidermy and art. Such collections of memorable actors of the Revolution as Gilbert Stuart's portraits and Charles Wilson Peele's gallery of worthies show the eagerness with which this generation sought to record and preserve the faces of those who witnessed the triumphant birth of the nation in immemorial rhetoric, political invention, and decisive deeds. Both the Stuart on the right and the Peele on the left are of Thomas Jefferson. Identity, the Portrait Project argues, survives the death and decay of the body only in the memory of the living, and that memory must be triggered, reinforced, and instructed by the continuing presence of eyewitness accounts, including prominently painted and sculpted portraits. It included the deliberate and systematic effort on the part of some, such as George Catlin, to fix on canvas prominent representatives of what he understood to be a dying race. These were parallel projects, I argue, to rescue individual noble presence from the finality of death and the anonymity into which death reduces all heads and faces. What other projects intersect with the early national period's enthusiasm to fix in memory, to fix in all future memories, the deeds, words, and persons who catapulted the nation to nationhood, and the faces of indigenous notables whose nations were summarily incorporated into that larger nation? These 2 busts from the 1770s are of Jefferson and Voltaire, both by Houdon. In ancient Rome, elite households kept their senatorial progenitors alive and present to them in the form of wax masks and later marble busts. In this practice, the Romans of the Republic foregrounded the concept of the family line with its inherited privileges and responsibilities, and in this they gave the dead presence among and surveillance over the living. The imago, a mask that was also an exact copy portrait, was created for a man upon his election to the Senate. It was stored with the carefully labeled imagos of his ancestors in labeled cupboards in the atrium, which you see in this diagram on the left, at the center and the most public part of the Roman house. This imago, this wax mask, this precise portrait of the ancestors and the present senator, these were worn by actors impersonating those ancestors in the family funeral processions. These wax masks and the marble bust portraits that evolved out of the practice of making and wearing them in the early imperial period were associated with Republican mores and values, with distinguished service, political legitimacy, and the continuing active role of illustrious ancestors within the household. It's logical, then, that Jefferson and his generation would appropriate this tradition, expanding the concept of genetic ancestor to include moral, political, and military models of exemplary citizenship. Could I have the next on the left, please? As in the case of the newly elevated Roman statesman, in which the fidelity of the portrait mask to truth was of supreme importance, so was the concept of exact copy important to the sculptors and great men who were their subjects in the early national period. To achieve this precision in features and the insight those features were thought to yield concerning the sources and nature of greatness, life masks were often taken, here of the Marquis de Lafayette by Houdon in 1785 on the left, and John Henry Isaac Brower on the right. Thomas Jefferson had a life mask taken in 1825 by the latter operator, and his report was one of a near-death experience. The sculptor needed to resort to the mallet and chisel to free him from the hardened plaster. While the wax, terracotta, plaster, or marble bust can be said to represent the Mediterranean tradition imported to the New World, a second tradition, also imported at the same time, crossed paths with that ancient usage in that hall at Monticello. Could I have the next on the left, please? In Northern Europe, long before canvas was stretched on wood stretchers, painted with pigment suspended in oil, framed in gilt, and tacked onto walls, those walls had other ornaments, trophies of war and trophies of the hunt. Hung high above the hall, where the baron reveled with his knights, weapons and flags captured in battle were assembled into symmetrical and aesthetic arrangements, like steel and fabric bouquets, to bring to memory those tales of ancestral victories that gave the family and the tribe its booty, its territory, and its identity. Hung here as well were the trophies of the hunt, as that hunt was not only a quest for food and a ritual foray into nature, it was also a rehearsal for battle. In the hunt, cunning and courage, teamwork and violence were practiced weekly, preparing the community for those less frequent occasions on which these skills would be tested, with much higher stakes on humans. To memorialize these adventures, triumphants, and their rewards, the heads of particularly large and difficult kills were hung, their skulls and elegant antlers presiding over the feasting of lesser beasts that took place in that venue nightly. So we can think of the medieval hall as the site of cooking and eating and sleeping, but it was, as the walls in this 19th century watercolor of a 15th century English house tell us, prominently the site of tale-telling and memory, a place where these questions were posed and partly answered. What are the memorable events in our history? What are our rights to this place? Who are we as a family, a tribe, a community, a people? Thomas Jefferson's Monticello draws together all these usages of trophy heads. Here we find the marble-like busts of worthies, including Jefferson's transatlantic contemporaries, Lafayette and Voltaire, whose deeds and wisdom the third president wished to keep visible before him every day. Here we also find the heads of the great beasts that Meriwether Lewis and William Clark sent back from their expeditions in the Western Territories, in part to help Jefferson refute the claims of the Comte Georges Louis de Buffon, the prominent French naturalist who advanced a theory of American degeneracy. That is, the proposition that all species in the New World were smaller in size and otherwise inferior to those of Europe. Jefferson, as you can imagine, exerted himself to refute Buffon, including writing the notes on the state of Virginia, and sending to France the skeleton of an American moose, in what was clearly a "my moose is bigger than your moose" gesture. Lewis and Clark, their survey and the exhibition of trophies of the expedition signaled metonymically to Jefferson and his visitors not only the riches and amplitude of natural resources in that distant region, but also Jefferson's and the nation's proxy mastery of that landscape and those regions. Napoleon Bonaparte, as you will recall, gave up throwing his armies fruitlessly at the slave rebellions on the French islands in the Caribbean, and having surrendered those lucrative properties, he had no need for the vast Louisiana territories, kept in his model of political economy primarily as a breadbasket to feed the island populations. Before he sent them west to survey his purchase of Louisiana, Jefferson sent Meriwether Lewis to Philadelphia to study modern scientific methods of recording natural history phenomena. Could I have the next on the left, please? There he saw Charles Willson Peale's museum, housed in the State House, where that artist had assembled the bones of a mastodon, the taxidermized animated bodies of 760 New World birds, arranged in Linnaean classifications, among other exhibits of natural history. Over the birds, in handsome gilt frames, an 1807 guide to the museum notes, are 2 rows of portraits of distinguished personages, painted from the life by Charles Willson Peale and his son Rembrandt, a collection begun in 1779, including, and by 1823, that collection included 240 portraits. In Peale's mind, these accurate images, painted from the life, were not discontinuous with the natural history taxonomies among which they were hung, but rather, in his words, represented the animal man in its most exemplary form. Among birds and raptors that occupy the position at the top left corner of the boxed dioramas with the national symbol, the bald eagle, in pride of place at the left upper corner. Humans were hung high above these cases, not because Peale didn't want viewers to see the details of their faces, but because in the Linnaean system, humans were above the creatures. In Peale's words, in the animal kingdom, man is placed in first class and first order, called primates. He nevertheless stands as an animal in the system of nature at the head of this order. May I have the next on the left, please? These Kit Kat bust portraits included founding fathers such as John Adams. And the next on the left, please. But also remarkable Native American warriors such as Joseph Brant. And the next on the left, please. And the distinguished Europeans who rallied to the American cause, most notably the Marquis de Lafayette, the visionary French teenage orphan who showed up on Washington's doorstep in 1777 to lend his considerable talents and money to the patriot cause. Could I have the next on the left, please? In the wake of his successful tour of the United States in 1824, Lafayette was included in a full-length portrait in Peale's gallery. Next to Washington, he was probably the most popular military figure of the Revolution. When visitors at the outset of the 19th century saw Peale's gallery, they saw not only worthy men held up to the future's emulation, and an orderly system of natural specimens arranged to educate viewers in the order of nature. They also saw these specimens arranged in dioramas stuffed and animated to resemble life. This was new, as taxidermy was a new practice that preserved not just the skull and horns of trophy animals, but also their heads and hides, and in some cases their bodies, so that they could be hung in as almost animate, beheaded sculptural creatures, as we saw in the buffalo at Monticello. Taxidermy of trophy animals takes this moment of the kill, of triumph over a specific creature, and freezes it as a near-animate sculpture, as a vivid mnemonic of a vivid moment. Peale was proud of his accomplishments in portraiture as a vehicle of memory. As he put it, by good and faithful paintings, the likeness of man is perhaps with greatest precision handed down to posterity. But he hoped for more. He had a vision, as he put it, of other means to preserve and hand down to succeeding generations the relics of such great men by preserving their bodies from corruption, the actual remains of such men. That is, he sought to taxidermize humans. Specifically, he mourned that he had not had the forethought to, as I put it, propose the means of such preservation so that that distinguished patriot and worthy philosopher, Dr. Franklin, so that the remains of his body would be now on our view. Franklin was, in the opinion of Jefferson and many others, the greatest man and ornament of the age. Peale clearly hoped that some resonance of this aura and its authenticity could be visible in the taxidermized body of this astonishingly accomplished autodidact. but it didn't happen, and it's probably just as well. Could I have the next on the left, please? This push toward fixing the facts and authenticating details of specific faces bled over into history painting when John Singleton Copley and John Trumbull, whose Death of General Warren at the Battle of Bunker's Hill you see here, and Declaration of Independence, revolutionized that genre by painting true and accurate faces in their complex tableau. The attempt was to memorialize, beyond the faintest possibility of forgetting, those faces and those deeds. In this move to combine the genre of history painting and portraiture, a particularly American innovation was created. The project was both to encompass the tales of heroic and decisive battles, long a staple of Native American as well as European art, as well as record the specific physiognomies of the actors of those battles and those events. To underline a relationship between the two kinds of history painting, Jefferson hung a particularly splendid buffalo hide record of a Native American battle in proximity to a print of Trumbull's Declaration of Independence in his entrance hall. Jefferson at Monticello and Peale in Philadelphia hung portraits of those of their generation they sought to hold up to themselves, to their families, to the public, and to the future, as models of human ingenuity, courage, originality, and will. But it's important to remember that both hung them among heads of very different sorts. Together, this disparate assemblage of heads provides us with a portrait of Jefferson, Peale, and their compatriots as exemplary of that ingenious generation. Unlike the generally private role of almost all head-hanging in the colonial period, when portraiture was about the family as a diachronic entity, portraiture in the early national period took on these much more public functions. Could I have the next on the left, please? Portraits in the early national period helped citizens understand the order of nature, recall memorable public events, as well as see with eyewitness authority the potential for human virtue to instruct the future. Painters like Charles Willson Peale and collection gatherers like Jefferson created a corpus of works like those ancient Roman masks in which the dead were intended to remain active among the living. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of our speakers for those three wonderful papers, which I think prove beyond doubt that Buffon was wrong and that the New World is in no way inferior to the Old. If the speakers would like to take seats at the table, we do have 10 minutes or so for question and comment. And there will be microphones circulating. So if you wish to ask a question or make a comment, if you could wait until the microphone reaches you.
I don't know exactly the pigments he used for the curtain, actually. That would be interesting, though. One thing that is, I think, relevant to keep in mind with this painting is that actually one of the decay problems that Copley was worried about was precisely that his colors would shift as the painting was traveling over the Atlantic Ocean. He felt that he had hurried the painting along to try to get it sort of into the mail in time for the show at the Society of the Artists, and he did, in fact, mention in a letter that he was concerned about the colors fading or shifting over the seas. So I'm not really an expert on pigments, but I would be very interested in learning more about how color itself is affected by these corrosive effects of sea travel.
Well, the reason I asked was whether it might be vermilion, because it's vermilion red ferric sulfide, which is a very important pigment in terms of the whole alchemical tradition. Talking about the mercury and philosopher's stone. And of course, Mercury is the god of travel.
Oh, that's great. Okay, you're going to be in my footnotes. Wow.
I think vermilion would be perfect for vermilion.
Absolutely, that's great. Well, no, that's exactly the kind of thing that I'm especially interested in here is thinking of other ways to understand the material of painting as something that isn't eternal, but something that is affected by its transmission, by media, and that's really an ideal.
Because all the emblems on the table too could think of in terms of the elements of nature, earth, water, air, and fire.
Yeah.
The peanut, earth, the squirrel, air,
Absolutely.
water, and the sort of control chain towards fire.
Absolutely. And the table too is sort of an image of water and reflective surfaces, and absolutely. That's very interesting. Thank you very much for that comment.
Thank you.
That's great.
Graham.
Okay. It is working now. Graham Betcher, Birmingham Museum of Art. A comment and a question for Professor Roberts. Your talk got me thinking about how Copley knew very well of a very large piece of undelivered cargo, namely Smibert's Bermuda Group, which
Yes.
never made it to Baron Wainwright back in Ireland.
Exactly.
And in some ways, they have certain similarities. Wainwright's portrait within the Bermuda Group is nearly a profile. He's, after all, the person who put up the money for the portrait. So, again, linking him with commerce. I'm wondering if perhaps you have any comments on how, if there is a connection between the Bermuda Group and its failure as both a piece of cargo and as a expedition, if you will, and how Copley may have responded
Right.
to that.
Well, I actually think you've basically answered your own question. You're right that I think it's part of this universe of failed transmission that Copley would have contended with every day. And of course, much of what he knew about European painting and the kind of aesthetic theories that he was interested in adopting, he knew from Smibert's work that was in Boston, following Smibert's presence there. And so I think if we are to look anywhere for models of this kind of failure and for conversations that he may have had surrounding the problem of the communication of paintings, that Smibert would in fact be exactly where to look. And that's very interesting. I hadn't actually thought through that connection to The Boy with the Squirrel, but I think that there might be interesting ways that I would like to think, for example, about the table in both paintings, because actually in Boy with the Squirrel is really the first point where Copley really, I think, adopts the motif of this reflective table that separates the sitter and the viewer that we see in so many of his later paintings, that really became something of a signature for him. It's Boy with a Squirrel where he first adopts that, and now you're making me think that perhaps there is some connection between the table as a surface of passage that may in fact fail between that painting and the Smibert. So thank you. That's great.
Could I add a note on that? I've become convinced that painting was never intended to go back to Wainwright, that it was intended to go to Bermuda, which is to say to have another sea trip,
Right.
to be an ornament in the college that Berkeley was planning to establish there. That was its intent.
And yet, it still would be a failure in
Oh,
that
it didn't-
case. Yeah,
it didn't
so
go.
that's great.
It didn't
No,
leave
the Bermuda situation was
Right.
again this major failure of transport that
Well,
occurred at
it's
this
the
point.
failure of much.
Right, and it's precisely that failure that allowed Copley to have access in a way to Smibert's legacy there.
Oh, one more question to Jennifer. And I'm a modernist, so this is probably embarrassingly
Is that
oblivious.
Jonathan?
Yes, Jonathan
Okay.
Katz, hi. Embarrassingly oblivious, but I'm trying to understand what seems to me your silence about, at least what I understand is the densest note of signification in that painting in a transatlantic context, which is the relationship between the boy and the squirrel.
Yeah.
One of domesticity of a wild creature, a clear power relationship, and I was wondering why you didn't evoke that in this context.
Because I only had 20 minutes.
Okay.
But I think that there are very interesting things going on between the boy and the squirrel. If you actually look at the relationship between the boy and the body of the boy and the body of the squirrel, try to make this as quick as possible. The boy, as I mentioned very briefly with that image of the diffraction of his senses across the surface of the painting, the boy's body, which is in many ways flattened out and abstracted across the surface of the painting as if it were a print or a profile or another one of these technologies of transit. All of the shapes of the boy, which are kind of spread flatly across the painting, are gathered and condensed in the body of the squirrel in a very interesting way. The curve of the back of the squirrel exactly matches the curve of the back of the boy. The curve of Pelham's ear is perfectly picked up in the curve of the squirrel's, the little oracular fur line in the squirrel's body. And more importantly, I think the squirrel is a point in the painting in which this node where the squirrel's nose and nut and paws are all coming together is this image of kind of sensory intensity and focus that the boy does not have in the painting. So in some ways, I think that the squirrel is, in fact, the most important figure in this painting. It's the squirrel that provides a visual connection between the viewer and the painting, not the boy. And the squirrel is, I think, in a way, teaching the viewer how to look at the painting as something that perhaps has traveled kind of flatly across the Atlantic, but then has arrived in London as a kind of full and present entity. I hope that makes some sense.
It does, but can I just ask very quickly, then are you saying that there isn't a relationship in which the squirrel is seen as this wild creature domesticated by a larger, more powerful entity, and that is not part of the meanings of the circulated image?
I wouldn't. I think that it does. I think it does enter into the painting in as much as the entire painting is about this the kind of civilization and overcoming of other kinds of natural and wild situations, namely the Atlantic itself. So I think that we can see that kind of operation moving through this. I think there are also some very important connections going on between the squirrel and this entire painting and the question of slavery and the passage of slaves across the Atlantic as well, but that's a very large topic that we certainly don't have time to go into now. But yes, the answer is yes. I do think it's important, but it wasn't necessarily the focus of this.
Thank you. If I may, I'd like to kind of expand something that I think is implicit in Jonathan's question for all three of you, which is one of the things I found most striking about the succession of the three papers was the sense in which, at some level, they were all about violence, in the sense that Kevin's paper was clearly about images as participants in the promotion of violence. In Margaretta's paper, there's this sense of beheading and hunting and violence as necessary to the production of images. And Jennifer, in a slightly different way, talked about the image or the object as the victim of violence in terms of decay and crossings and loss and damage and so forth. And I wondered whether all three of you would just like to say a little more, very briefly, about the relationship between violence and the aesthetic, and whether this is something that thinking about the global situation inevitably takes us towards. I don't know who wants to...
Can you repeat the last part? No. Violence, aesthetic, and the global.
This is now rather embarrassing. As a moderator, you're meant to kind of facilitate things and move them on. I feel I've kind of brought things to a halt. So.
I mean, I guess in my case, it was that was the, I see it as that was the way to get people to behave. As I say, with the implicit, the implication of it there. But at the same time, I guess one could say, in my case, that violence is the purpose of the portraits and the painting here is not to. It's down below, and it doesn't come up. So, I mean, I hadn't thought of violence as a kind of continuity between our three papers. So. That was a non-answer, but I've bought some time, I hope, for Margaretta to say something to save this idea here.
Well, I do think beheadings were very much on my mind. Because they're, yes, the aestheticization of violence. I think there's a reason that we don't taxidermize our pets, although we could. You know, we could have the heads of our cats and dogs in our living room. But this is a cultural dead end because those heads are memories of violence and of power relations that we don't like to sort of think about in terms of ourselves, and our, forefathers like Benjamin Franklin. I mean, we're just as glad that he wasn't taxidermized, although Jeremy Bentham was, and his body has not been treated entirely with the respect that, I mean, that's one of the issues, right? Is the downside of doing that. But yes, aestheticization. That's the way we hold up to ourselves what we want to remember, and in some cases, what we do want to remember is violence. Certainly, the trophies of the hunt are all about that, and it's not far away. And the 3 beheaded figures in Jefferson's collection, I haven't thought this through. I haven't thought through why those images were of interest to Jefferson. He wasn't personally a violent man, I think. George Washington was a military person, so I can understand why he wanted ferocious beasts, as well as Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar, and to be before him. But why St. John's head? Why Goliath's head in Jefferson's? I can't tell you what's going on there, but yeah, there's an edge. There's an edge.
I thought of something. Also, I just been thinking too about when a person or an object is in the state of transit, is moving between spaces. It comes, especially when this person is a person, it comes into very uncomfortable relationship with commodity relationships and commodity status. And I think that this is something that is haunting Copley's work, as well as really the main species of transit in the Atlantic at this point, namely the transit of slaves, in that when something is moved from place to place, it becomes a piece of cargo, and there's an inherent violence involved in that operation when that thing being transported is in fact a human being. And this is really, I think, the central question for globalization and Atlantic studies at this point in the 18th century is how did the opening of this global commodity system, this system in which objects were moved from place to place, how did that complicate relationships between humans and animals, between humans and teapots, and what sort of violence did that do to the very philosophical systems that upheld Enlightenment politics and their later involvement in the 18th century.
So would this time period be more violent than previous time? Does this kind of trade, you know what I'm saying, like, okay, so bodies moving in this circuits are at the most risk, right? When you're sitting still, nothing ostensibly is going to happen. When you're driving your car, you're moving, you're more risked. And then, but is it 18th century? I'm just thinking.
Well, no, I don't think it's, I mean, but I think that in as much as the 18th century, especially in British culture, is the point when problems of the abstraction of material particularity through systems of money and credit and the commodity system really takes off and builds the global system as we know it now. This is where the question, at least, becomes incredibly acute, and it begins to be asked, I think, more frequently and more in more of a direct manner of the status of these objects when they're moving. The violence, even if it isn't necessarily a physical violence to a body crossing the ocean or a slave crossing the ocean, there is a kind of categorical violence that it seems that everyone was trying to work through at this point.
At that point, I realize there are a few more questions, but I think we will have to close the session here. The next session will start on the dot at 11, so it just remains for me to thank once more our three speakers for three really fabulous papers.